Hello everyone, today we talk about high medieval economics, mostly about agriculture of course, but also about techniques in general, technology, labor, work in general, communications, right? These are all things that we discussed here and there. We made also important videos on, but it's important to expand on it, to insist on it, because of course we do it from different perspectives every time, so this enriches the comprehension of the period of the time. This period that has been historiographically very much covered, as you know, it's known, right? How many times you've heard about the so-called agricultural revolution, right? There was no revolution, I would say today. It's a complete myth invented by the Marxists in the 1960s, where they wanted to pretend that only socio-economical factors were, you know, the ones that made, for some reason, the society expand. It's really not the case, right? The reason why Europe expanded dramatically much, and also from an economical point of view in output, is due to factors that are comprehensive, that do not have to do with, first of all, not with technology, not with those kind of, not even of innovations about any particular, you know, those were just following the expansion of a, you know, as we will see, is an increase in labor force. That is something you have to explain, not because somebody invented a new agricultural tool, but because they needed at that point, in a different condition from before, a new agricultural tool that in itself didn't make the thing, nor increased particularly the crop rate, right? These things have been profitably been debunked, right, in the last generations, in fact. So it's important to look at the wall, as always, to understand also the detail and how to interpret it, how to frame it in the picture. So, first of all, it's also still a period that we don't know particularly much. That is to say, we can see the trend, but we don't have that level of documentation that reveals us, you know, in ultra detail what, I don't know, life was at the time, right? These are still primitive, archaic times where we don't have the sources. We can't see concretely what most life was about. For example, it's extremely difficult to evaluate how much the cultivated areas expanded in this time, right? We understand, however, this happened, right? The success of the growth didn't depend only on the availability of surfaces to put to cultivation, right? Perhaps even a greater importance had the possibilities and the capacities to already, you know, to develop further, let's say, the productivity and to capitalize upon the potential, the abundance of the potential of other crucial resources, were the techniques and the quantity of human labor that, again, weren't quite discovered out of you know, homogeneously, uniformly, as a sort of, you know, practice that, you know, nobody had ever thought of, and then they began to use it. No, it was a gradual, practically non-rationalized as such development that was kind of necessary to those communities, had they had enough, you know, capacities just to make it work, right? The knowledge was there fundamentally already, right? As for most things, right? It wasn't like an abyss of ignorance for which some genius came out and started making things work. This is what, of course, all the progressivistic, technologistic, and modernistic bias has fed people for a couple of centuries. That has completely nothing to do with any historical reality in any period, in any time, in any place. So significant improvements, especially in cereal farming, were obtained thanks to the adoption of new plowing systems. In the based alluvial plains of Central and Northern Europe, but also in the Po Valley, the light plow, right, the traditional one, the one that existed since ancient times in the Mediterranean, that was mostly essentially in wood and with the plowshare in reinforced with an iron tip, gave way to a heavier plow, was entirely in metal and often provided with a mold board to turn the cloth upside down, right? That allowing a greater exchange of nitrogenous substances rendered the soil more fertile, right? And the efficiency of such plow was further improved with the usage of wheels, of the shoeing of the animal's hooves, and the adoption of new ways, let's say, to yoke the animals to tow, that, by the way, allowed to exploit fully the greater force of the horse compared to the one of the ox. So as you immediately understand, there is nothing revolutionary about this technology, right? It's essentially an elementary understanding that the fact that there are, better materials, that there are essentially, what is the change here? That they had more resources to obtain finally the tools that they needed, right, in order to do something different even in here. So it's not just the material availability, it's also the ideal, what were they doing it for, right, that do not constitute such, a difficult, thing to conceive in the first place, but that you need those preconditions to make it work, right? Every peasant would have been capable of doing that. There was no scientist that had to teach them, or a scholar, or technologist that had to teach them how to think. Those peasants thought that, if they could have organized things in a certain way, or better, if, at this point, as we will see, it's the lords rather than manage this work, and so who had the means. But if they, even they could have chosen, of course, if provided those resources, peasants would have already known that would have been a more effective way of working the land, because again, there was nobody that knew better how the land worked fundamentally than them, right? The problem was to organize this work now in a different way and finding the means in order to work in such fashion. And as we will see, these changes weren't even just qualitative, right? Nor, for example, for the peasant's life, many times, but also not even for the crop rates as such, right? And it was just a tool, employed to, say, functionalize to a different time of land, a different type of land exploitation and management. Also, these animals are, first of all, you have to have them, which is not just something that everybody can have, nor that can just be taken for that specific employment, right? You need an abundance of horses, for example, to be employed in certain fields, and certain types of horses, certain ways of breeding them, or of having them available, which is just, as you understand here, not just what the average peasant would have had in Europe in the first place. And therefore, such single and specific innovations, relatively, as the ones we've just seen, do not have to be considered as causes of the growth, right? Primarily, at least, it's in the first place, demonstrated by the fact that it is not possible, first of all, even to date back their adoption to a precise period. So that is, of course, this technology is already, were already known. It didn't take any wizard to find them out, right? To take them out of a hat, out of nothing, right? They're very simple concepts, right? And another very meaningful aspect of this is that the first European regions in which we are informed about their presence, right? And so we're talking about the 8th century Slavic and Bohemian Central European plains, right? So, as you understand, these weren't places that weren't at the lead of economical transformation in Europe at the time. So you can argue on why they appeared for the first time in those areas, right? And you understand that the reason might have not been actually because that was such a dramatic. Maybe they needed a more dramatically improvement because the situation was more difficult there. So they were pressured to invest in that, but not because they were in a better situation. And as we will see in certain areas of Europe, even some that were more fertile. In fact, some of the traditional plow remained in use, right? And this didn't affect actually these areas from growing some of the most developed. So, and conversely, we can demonstrate that other novelties, such as windmills, spread in more precociously, let's say in areas that had been more precociously invested by the growth, only after that this had already manifested, right? This is true also for encapsulation, for a number properly of investments, because this is what they were, that were rendered possible only when the growth had already happened, right? And windmills existed, even just the technology from millennia, right? The fact that they were revived in high medieval Europe doesn't actually mean that somebody had to be told what a windmill was in the first place, because of course they had existed in the first place, even when we don't have the actual documentation of them, because we know barely anything. So we can't say that, because we can see through the scarce evidence that there wasn't in such, complex systems like also the ones of early medieval Europe, after all, were. We don't have to exaggerate either the importance of the fallow land, let's say the so-called triennial rotation of the land, that is essentially leaving every year only 1/3 of the terrain resting, right, which allowed in spring the sowing of grasses, of gramineaceae, let's say, in the portion of land that the previous years had been used for the cereals that grow during winter. And the dry summers of southern Europe prevented the autumn harvests, but also in the latitudes that were more favored by the new system, this wasn't applicated everywhere. Not even when there was even the possibility of doing it. So again, that wasn't even the thing. So the medieval technological change, right, was in reality a much more complex phenomenon than the adoption of new tools or equipments, or of a specific, say a new specific agricultural practice, and imported from somewhere in Asia and known from centuries. Almost all the principal medieval, let's call it, inventions that, again, they weren't invented because they already knew them since from a long time, spread, right, for us to have enough sources to document it consistently in a way that, in a very gradual way, in the moment in which it was necessary, rather, to cope with the needs of the demographic increase, right? A great part of this kind of can't call it industrial scale, of course, but the idea that, why also these larger structures, this more larger scale systems of production were there, right? Was about the quantity sometimes, was about providing enough calories to feeding, right, people, which doesn't even mean that these calories are assumed in the best way, right? There is all the debate on, the early medieval peasant that was kind of better fed because it had more fats and proteins, because in theory the freeman had a greater, was kind of more autonomous, could variate, there were less people, so there were more resources. Instead, in later feudal times, it was just the lord that controlled all these masses of peasants and fed them just with, bread and carbohydrates, would kind of weaken at the end of the day, just with this monotonous diet, their immunity defenses. The idea is that it was a miserable world in both situations. It wasn't absolutely that, we cannot demonstrate at all that early Middle Ages were easier for the freedmen, right? You don't just, come out in a fertile land where everything grows and you can get, and then there's just evil guys centuries later that prevents you from doing that because it wants just the whole thing. No, the truth is that these communities had always struggled dramatically to produce enough early medieval times weren't easier, where there was simply less surplus, it's evident. And we see that in low medieval times things are improving. Of course, it depends also on how wealth was distributed. There's no doubt that feudalism kind of broadened that divide. There were other, like in the communes, wealth was more evenly distributed. This brought to important changes in civilization from one side and the other. But there were different systems that were, however, coexisting and still kind of cooperating, first of all, but also trying to find, in fact, say different solutions, but from their different background, but to a same aim at the end of the day. And also they behaved actually quite similarly in some fashion. And no surprise they would kind of ally them, against the peasantry in general towards the late Middle Ages. But in general, let's say the importance of feeding greater masses. And this is something also that we cannot quite measure. People before believed it was all about climate change, of warming of the climate that brought to less child deaths essentially, and so more people growing up needing to be fed. Others say simply, humans tend just to expand themselves wherever they find resources independently from other factors, which I definitely agree. Surely, maybe climate change helped, but it wasn't the decisive thing either in this context. That, however, let's stress it also, in all fairness, yes, they were very fragile system and thus very much sensitive to climate, to things like changes in temperature. This is kind of obvious even looking at, look at the development in the northern countries compared to the ones of the southern countries. The weather really made a great importance. It had always made it at that point. But it is in this moment, in fact, that the expansion starts occurring a bit everywhere. In relative terms, the north was poor, but began to grow at a faster rate than the south, at least in certain areas like England, certain parts of Germany, because evidently it wasn't just a matter of climate, of geography. It was about who was ruling there and how and why and with which means and with which international interaction. Remember that this system was all intertwined. Europe at this point is like, especially in the Western Christendom, was becoming really one thing and expanding even beyond its traditional boundaries, let's say. And so it's obvious that in this context, you need an increase in innovation. You have to adapt to the new political and social situations. So these technological acquisitions are, these technological innovations, of course, were overlapping and also surpassing at some point the traditional practice. But in absence of such demographic expansion, the production could have not sustained for such a long time increase in the demand of goods, right? So somebody had to work in the first place to make this happen. And again, this new means came from somewhere that weren't, of course, the same causes. So it's not even true that the innovations had the effect of producing a sort, in fact, of medieval revolution in the crop rate. Right? This was perhaps the greatest myth that was brought forward by, again in the 60s by Van Baat, de Vie, etc. And it was actually, it was already a thing before, but it was still believed at the time. And the crop rates, especially intended as the quantity of product that was on average collected for a cultivated, cultivated area, right? A unit, right? Whatever. Think about the Mansi initially speaking, and then there were other measures of other measures, in fact. But the average crop rates of the Carolingian era that can be appreciated in the good harvest and good years in a ratio, let's say, seed and harvest close to 1 to 3 fundamentally, became in the best of hypothesis only more regularly close to the ratio 1 to 4, right? And it is true that there are areas in Europe where this is greater, like there are places in England, but again, even within the same country, these things varied wildly, and on average, that's not how much the things surpass. I understand that 1 to 3, 1 to 4 doesn't actually even mean that you are able to actually eat that 3 or that 4 times the amount that you have. So it's a big deal, and observed for all. Of course, the way that these were harvested included in itself all the various threats that existed, the bad, and these were actually not even counting the bad harvests, right? But think about war in general, or other calamities that could occur later, even after the harvest had been collected, and which is something that we can't even properly measure scientifically, right? We know, of course, that these things happened just scholarly, but it's just we cannot connect them. Like, what the hell do we know? Even in the few times in which we have the actual information, extremely precious for the time, especially through the polyptychs of northern Italy, northern France, fundamentally. That's the only areas basically that we get something. We are consistent. You can't make a systematic inquiry. What the hell do we know whether that those what happened to the harvest that those polyptychs were documented, how they were invested, how much of that was wasted, because also that happens. And we can instead plausibly hypothesize an improvement in the crop rates per hectare on a pluriannual scale that was being realized gradually during the high medieval times. The passage from systems based on a largely extensive agriculture, right, on an extended amount of land and with prolonged periods of resting terrains, to the ever more frequent and specialized cultivation, into a more intense presence of human labor. So in other words, a concentration of work that before had never quite been seen, and naturally functional to a much more diversified market in itself. So meaning that, of course, the push came from the growth came from the previous amount of produced that had increased for some other reason, and that had favored the same curve. That was, again, due to factors that we cannot ascribe just to economy extrapolated from, let's say, without any political context, for example. So again, it doesn't have to be necessarily have been an environmental reason as a decisive factor, or whichever, again, even less technology, as always in history, but something that had to do with the way communities were organized, which is and how, which suggests, of course, that given that these were the centers of affirmation of feudalism, that such improvement was mediated by the rise of a more hierarchic society, right, that contributed dramatically to the development of Europe altogether, right? An enormous amount of wealth was finally being producible in an ever more rationalized and competitive way, right? So in all the rural central areas, the peasants were obliged to increase the density of the cultivated areas in relation to the surface, to diminish the intervals of resting of the land and specializing the cultivations, which would have not been possible if, again, not only these communities hadn't been commanded and disciplined and oriented towards this direction, but if there hadn't been a market that would have allowed them to, specialize just in certain cultivations, I don't know, there were areas like Burgundy that by the 13th century said they lived only of wine. That is, they didn't, is an exaggeration, but the sources say they do not even cultivate anything. They don't do any other work of any kind because they can simply import all what they need by selling the wine. That's the only thing they work at. So in order to obtain these results, naturally the peasantry and the population in general adapted to a remarkable increase in the quantity and quality of work necessary to grant in over time satisfactory harvests that still, as cereal farming, etc., remained at the base of the world economy, right? And this is evident if we think, for example, to the generalized abandonment of practices such as controlled burning or tillage, or the colonization of agrarian areas in the frontier, right? But another important factor in this was the change in agricultural practices in the areas of older settlement, right? The ones that were actually more productive, and of course from which the growth had started most, right, to support this expansion. So the increase of the settlement density, which is mirrored by, we understand it, right? It was an important demographic growth at the time. The demand of alimentary resources and the possibilities of exchange of the surplus brought the family business, let's say, and the entire village to redistribute on the territory and to aggregate in different areas where, let's say, the different cultivations, thus specializing the production according to the position and kind of vocation of the terrains. So, as you understand, behind this there was also a different mentality relatively to the creation of, for example, rural communes, right? Not just having scattered houses of freemen without much of an affiliation, but starting to cooperate in this sense with a common interest that was exactly specializing in that production and growing accordingly and redistributing resources in a way that in a political way, so also with assemblies, councils, and so on. And even this more scientific and rational use of the rural spaces, if from one side allowed to increase production, from the other side it absorbed greater quantities of work. That is, better plows and tools, use of chattel, mills, water mills also, oil mills, empowered fundamentally in turn the effectiveness in the work of a man, right? But at the same time they increased its same consumption, right? In the regions north of the Alps, where the plains apt to cereal farming were wider, right? Often around the villages was formed a structure in open fields, right, constituted by very long and thin parcels of land, the open fields, in fact, that are particularly useful for the heavy plow, because you can't just go through all the length in one row, and to the practice of triennial rotation that favored also the birth and the maintenance of a community management of agricultural life, as we've seen, and of forms of seasonal collective work, right? The common use of the chattel of the animals, and also the vast portions of forest, right, that were left left intact by the wave of clearance that had happened, right? Deforestation, especially in countries like, if you pick France, Germany, right? The forest is really a world on its own still, because there were enormous ones all the time. And in the south, instead, where the climate and the lighter terrains, except in Italy with the Po Valley, right, maintained the usage of the traditional plow, and the rotations were, at maximum biennial, right? With the prevalence of a parcelization of cultivated lands around peasant villages of net form, right? So in a more complex fashion, accompanied by hedges, fences that were, let's say, was more apt to forms of cultivation in which the forest had fundamentally retracted on the, at the base of the foothills, at least of the highest hills and of the mountain areas, in that where the gramineous grasses flanked the orchards, the vineyards, the olive cultivations and so on. But everywhere, independently from the rotation systems, in order to be more intensely exploited without impoverishing the land, required a better preparation before the sowing, right? Operations, let's say, more regular operations of weeding, irrigation, and fertilization. Also the terracing of the hills, all right, and in the hills, in the hill areas. And at the end of the day, the medieval people found themselves to have diminished, in a sense, the leisure time, right, and increased the ones of labor on the fields, right? So the independently from how this happened from a political, social point of view, the important is that more people were at work than before, right? And in a more intensive way, in a more rationalized way, so in a way that was much more effective than before. So as a consequence, the quantity of product for available units of land increased, but the one of labor units, let's say, diminished for the same. So rather than improving the complex agricultural productivity, the continuous renewal of the agricultural technologies was limited to prevent the diminution as long as it went on, together, as long as the demographic growth went on. And the new methods of cultivations and the technological improvements served to maintain stable and to extend to a greater percentage of terrains in spite of the intensification of the agricultural exploitation for surface, say, cultivated surface units. The levels of, say, the crop rates proper, that in the early Middle Ages had been probably the habitual prerogative only of the most rational and effective courtly businesses, farms, let's say. And in this scenario of a population and of production in regular rise, the balance between man and agricultural resources was thus ensured by the prolonged growth of all the productive factors: the land, the work, the investment, so the chattel, the tools, the techniques, and so on. And the continuous process of technological innovation didn't invest just the cultivation. The demographic increase that pushed towards the increase to the alimentary consumption increased also the volumes of the transformation activities and widened in a substantial measure the demand of raw non-organic products such as salt, metals, and also manufactured goods, of course. So there was a coming back of stone building, right? That since antiquity had declined importantly, and that of course required greater technical capacity and more work of the ones in wood, right? And even in here, the Middle Ages doesn't seem to have actually ever lost knowledge of how to make things work. Again, it's just that as long as this growth occurs, these techniques come back, right? There was no they copied the manuals from the classical thing that were coming through the Arabs. No, actually it was the other way around, exactly because they had started already building those things on their own. They started, since also they were increasingly more literate, to go pick, because they knew where they were and were already educated for that matter, those ancient classical works, to make kind of a more systematic, mostly to not because of reasons of authority, but actually to integrate them in the things in the in the practice they already knew, and to give it maybe a more theoretical vest for the new students, but where the thing was already standing in place. This is what is often not understood about the rise of the West at that point. This is to be seen, of course, as constructions, in the churches, the sacred buildings, in the lay ones, in the bridges, in the roads, in the fortifications. So a textile production also developed on a larger scale. This was destined to the circulation and the selling on the markets, and not anymore prevalently or exclusively even to the direct consumption of the peasants and of the landlords that, however, had never quite stopped just to that. And particularly intense was also the development of the activities and techniques of extraction and working of metals, right? We were just talking about it yesterday, right? Especially from the 9th century, it was a much better metallurgical, there was a great metallurgical employment, and in parallel, of course, to the development of cavalry, and it's essentially knighthood as we know it. And in fact, but not just for them, like as much as for the knights armored, also the agricultural tools were needed in the same ways as we've seen before, the metal plow and so on. And besides allowing the production of a greater quantity and variety of goods, this spectacular process of specialization of the crafts that is very evident in the West, unlike any other area, right, in the Mediterranean, in the Islamic world, right, in Europe, this booms. Think about all the corporations, the guilds, this international trade, this is present everywhere, right? The renewal of the traditional working of the raw materials, right? This all occurred especially between the 11th and the 12th century, right? This served in the first place to actually spare, we could say, to the labor force, spare properly the labor force itself employed in the fields, essentially freeing it from the weight of the non-strictly agricultural activities, right? The surplus was there, it had accumulated in the cities, so people start flocking in the cities and working there and producing more and specializing more, and these were more educated people. They could even invest in education, and we've seen it so many times in communal civilization, all these things. So this is a direct consequence of this whole process, right? The cities naturally floated on the agricultural booming that had paradoxically been brought forward, as we've seen, as a direction by the feudal elites, right? That had managed, rationalized it, organized it. And some of the principal innovations, such as the hydraulic wheel that was essentially applicated for the grind mills, and to the oil mills, and the mantises, and the nails for the forges, and the working of iron, for the fulling of the clothes, spread in the countryside as well, to satisfy, first of all, the growth need of the local communities and of their aristocracies, right? So it's remarkable, even in here, in an anti-classist interpretation of history, that of course such coercion, such hierarchization of society actually brought to the increase of wealth of the individuals, even in places where traditionally material wealth had been appallingly low, such as like in the countryside in the early Middle Ages, right? So yes, civilization does work like this, and capitalism is a hell of a cool thing, and the and Western Europe in the Middle Ages is probably the greatest example of this. Think about mercantilism later on, and also the banking, the Renaissance. I mean, that all came from that system. They didn't come from a just solely protectionistic closed system. Those systems fail, right? Without no activities, crafts, autonomies, didn't happen. So deconcentrate, but of course the state was needed in the process as well. right? So especially when there was a balance that could ensure these activities to remain. Right. And so the concentration of the settlements and the exchange activities, for example, in the larger villages, in the cities, ended up, however, to determine a more marked separation, also a spatial one, of the artisan work from the peasant one, right? That had somewhat previously been existed side by side in the courtly, industries. Let's say the working places and the rural life. So during the 12th and the 13th century, the new urban environment imposed itself not just as privileged place for the development of new crafts as a consequence, but also as true and proper permanent laboratory of experimentation and propagation of the most efficient productive techniques in the various sectors of working of the raw materials that provided goods, in general, textiles, hides, metals, work metals for the exchange with the surrounding countryside, or even on a longer distance. In textile production, especially, it was an extreme division of the work under the guide or the commission of the city markets. That is to be summed to the invention of the horizontal loom and the spread of the folding mill that used the principle of the hydraulic wheel for the folding of wool clothes. That, as you know, as production boomed, that allowed to the most advanced regions, the ones with highest population concentration and agricultural production. So essentially, Flanders, northeast France, central and northern Italy, to develop true and proper industrial districts, right? They were specialized in the production destined to local and extra-regional markets as well. And in fact, these are the regions that definitely embody the most all the state building, the juridical development, the economical prosperity, etc. So it's quite important to observe how the thing had happened in parallel, side by side. And the demographic growth and the productive effort that went on essentially for 400 years marked deeply even Western landscape. Like, one of the greatest transformations was the permanent change in the forms of settlement, right? And crowding on the territory, the population tended to concentrate in, let's say, in areas in areas that were neatly distinguished from the most scattered settlement, right? From the country houses, the rural districts, where still in the 11th and the 10th century, the majority of people lived, right? Essentially, we thought of this period for a long time as essentially the one of the rebirth of cities that we have talked so much in other videos. But the High Middle Ages was first and foremost, also at least, the age of creation of a net of permanent villages and boroughs that it is possible to estimate in something like 150,000 communities of 500, say maximum 1,000 inhabitants each, right, distributed on all the surface of today's Western Europe, which is an enormous deal at the root properly of the fabric of society, because again, everything was based on the countryside, right? It would remain until the Industrial Revolution. That's where the majority of people lived. That's what all the production came from, essentially. And the cities were just the pinnacle of the areas where the surplus was stored, and that could afford, in that sense, also greater control in the surrounding. But fundamentally, it's this enormous change is happens only in Western Europe as such, right? With this in this scale, and it is literally changing the ways people had lived for thousands and thousands of years. So the thickest net and the greatest demographic consistencies of such human concentration gave place to gave birth to a more extended and regular infrastructure also of communication routes, right? The Middle Ages remained an age in which the transportation of water was easier than the land one. In maritime navigation, the capacity, the speed, and security of the communications were further improved by increasing the dimension of the boats or improving the systems of sailing, but also introducing true and proper inventions such as the compass, the astrolabium. And this, of course, doesn't mean that on the base of that there wasn't like a base of massive work of investment of human labor and of continuous improvements, right? And that that brought even more spectacular improvement in the land transportation. That also was naturally more extended in a sense. So considering the people that still live mostly in the interland, right, as such. So, but that were connected also to the waterways in that regard. Think about the great Mediterranean ports or the waterways of Central Europe, right? So, in this way, they were all connected. I mean, and so all the great, I don't know, the Alpine passes, the pilgrimage routes, the Frankish road, the one of Santiago, right? All these were really big communication nets, right? That were connected, in fact, to all the interlands in a sense. So, for example, the rivers were also very much transformed in those ways that there were many ports had been created there, but also bridges, channels. Right? Think about areas of Europe like the old lowlands, right? That some of the efforts that was to reclaim land from the sea that were done starting since the Middle Ages in the areas of there. Was impressive, and it became usual not just rising going upstream with heavy loads for tens and sometimes even hundreds of kilometers along the great rivers such as the Rhine, the Rhone, the Po, the Seine, the Danube, but also to cross, let's say, also the minor rivers that were connected to them, internal courses of waters that were important not just regionally but also locally in that sense. So not less was the commitment in the widening and improvement of the land routes, right? The net of roads and paths that covered until up to the end of the 19th century the European territory was the one in great part that had been drawn and consolidated during the centuries of the great medieval growth, right? Exactly these ones, the 12th or 13th century, that were an enormous Europe compared just even to the late medieval one or even some of the early modern one in terms properly of inhabitants, right? So that roamed around, that travel, that worked, like, okay, it wasn't typical for everybody, but let's say the way to make the system work had required these routes, right? And there are many historically great studies on the English countryside, right, during the Middle Ages that tell us that a good half of the bridges that existed, that the English countryside was full of in the modern age, had been built during the High Middle Ages. In Italy of the independent city-states, in Tuscany, in Lombardy, starting from the 12th century, the communes were capable of coming back to expand towards from in their own territory the road net that was by that point, by the 12th century, not inferior to the Roman trade net. think about, when you think the Middle Ages as just, even for a second, if you have ever been deluded that the Middle Ages were a dark age, and you think that this is the case, like if you don't, this is first of all not the channel for you, but secondly, probably history is not really for you. This is a complete myth, right? And we could go on from this because you see the concentrated habitat and the massive communication widened enormously the opportunities of exchange and of work diversification among the various communities, determining the multiplication of, for example, weekly or however still periodical markets. In the same 13th century, the English crown distributed 3,000 charters of concession to the market rights. Right, not to all of this naturally corresponded effectively the birth of a new center of exchange, right? But it's being calculated, for example, that the constellation of the marketplaces of an English shire was at that point, satisfactorily dense to allow to half of the inhabitants to find themselves at a distance, an average distance that wouldn't surpass 10 kilometers, and therefore half days of walk, right, from at least 3 different markets. Just think about in the mentality, in the horizons of a person, what this meant compared to how people were used to live before. And similar results emerge also from the various available researches on regions such as France. For example, in Germany, also the spread from west to east of new villages and little cities, little towns, all of which concentrating around, let's say, centered around its ring, the central square that is the seat of the periodical market. Between the 11th and the first 14th century, multiplied by 10 the number of local markets. In 13th century Lombardy, it is to be spotted a hierarchy dominated and regulated by the city commune of, let's say, boroughs, weekly markets, say, to which were also minor rural settlements were connected. And that was an area, by the way, where already the let's say the countryside had never been an inch from the city in the first place, because every few tens of kilometers there was a real city, right? Not a town, like an actual massive thing with stone walls, with a major market, all connected all there by the an impressive road network. So even in there, think what this means compared to other areas in the same Europe at the time, and also in Mediterranean and beyond, like what it meant to have a mentality, to be exposed to such a complexity, and what this has as a consequence in the development of civilization. The complexity that you are used to in the first place, and to frame, to analyze, to exploit, right? So you wonder why eventually things develop dramatically in Western Europe. Well, this is the base of it. And enormously more complex, it is also the world that emerges from the high medieval growth, depending on the cultivations and the exchanges of the agricultural surplus that, as you understand, was now much greater to the past. The restructuration of the rural landscape had restricted the extreme variety of cultivated species on the typical early medieval parcel, let's say, that was functional to a self-consumption of an entire peasant family. And the food production tended to concentrate on basic products, essentially giving an ever greater space, as we're seeing in the beginning, to the cereals that were more useful to the planning So the rye for the poor, the wheat for the rich and the citizens, by the way, because those were coming sometimes to the same level of feudatories in terms of individual wealth. In the development of urban consumption and the textile manufacturing favored around the cities the grafting of specialized cultures such as the grapes or linen, or the chattel, right, breeding, or the cheese or wool production, while the regression of the uncultivated area limited the offer of the direct resources that had traditionally integrated also in the early medieval diet. But yes, they were more caloric, more proteic, but still they were not satisfactory to support the enormous demographic growth that required that extended cultivations to work. So the result of all this was a greater sensitivity to the local economic system, to the famines, right, that occurred periodically, and in fact determined frequently episodes of scarcity of food and especially of grain, right? And so the specter of famine that becomes that appears in the 9th century becomes almost obsessive in the 11th, right? So this shows the difficulties also in the transition. It was not a progressive thing in the form of just, okay, we are all fine, we found a way to do it. No, they had been forced to develop in this fashion because again they had to necessarily find quickly, right, the best way to feed everybody after this enormous demographic growth, and to compete, by the way, in all this expansion with other powers. I mean, it was a complex manner within the same Europe. So this, however, still signals the fact that such change had occurred, and therefore that it had occurred, by the way, much earlier than is commonly thought, because by the 11th century it was already there, and it had began from much earlier. Not just the tent, right? The tent is the moment in which everything is put in motion in a very, consistent fashion, but still by the 9th, the 8th, right? So where is also the Dark Age at the end of the day was just an extremely brief period all over the medieval millennium. The very early, 1 century, 150 years. Of course, every country also had a kind of a different story, but what is important here is that it was one of the costs of the transition from an extensive and stagnating economy with a low degree of development of exploitation of resources and productive specialization to a dynamic and greater, essentially larger, economical system with a greater intensity of work and of the usage of factors, even if it was still very far from the forms of regional and super-regional integration that would have characterized the late medieval and modern commercialization, of course, but still for other reasons that we'll have to see. Not, for example, with the same local absolute amount of wealth, right? That is important to stress as well. All right, but for today we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.